The stack of final notices and medical bills sat on the scarred wooden surface of the kitchen table like a mountain of broken promises. The red ink of the past due stamps seemed to bleed into the deep scratches of the oak, illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving glare of a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. A pair of hands, deeply lined, bruised by time and rough as dried leather, rested gently over the paper mountain. These were hands that had pulled barbed wire, birthed calves in the freezing Texas mud, and gripped the steering wheel of a rusted tractor until the knuckles turned white. The dust of the plains was practically tattooed into the creases of her skin. The unpaid bills were a cruel testament to a life spent entirely in the service of survival, a life where backbreaking labor was rewarded with a quiet, suffocating descent into poverty and illness. This was the reality of Martha, a woman whose existence was a testament to the stoic endurance of the rural South, a woman who was now losing her final battle not to the land she loved, but to the failing rhythm of her own lungs. Outside the window, the Texas sun began its slow burning descent, casting long, mournful shadows across the cracked earth of the empty ranch. The wind howled through the dry mesquite bushes, carrying with it the scent of impending rain that would never come, a phantom promise in a drought-stricken world. Martha had lived her entire life under the vast, indifferent sky of this state. When her husband was taken by a sudden, tragic accident involving a runaway horse and a broken plow decades ago, she did not weep in public. She simply tied her hair back, put on his heavy leather boots, and walked out into the fields to finish the harvest. She raised her children on a diet of cornbread, unwavering faith, and the crackling sounds of an old AM radio sitting on the porch rail. Through the blistering heat waves and the bone-chilling winter winds, the voices that poured out of that little silver speaker were her only sanctuary. The deep, steady baritone of George Strait reminded her of the strength of the earth, while the angelic, shimmering vibrato of Dolly Parton gave her the grace to look up at the heavens and believe that there was a purpose to her suffering. They were not just singers to her, they were the invisible neighbors who sat with her on the porch when the loneliness became too heavy to bear. Now that porch was miles away, replaced by the sterile, humming environment of a hospice clinic on the outskirts of San Antonio. The transition from the wide-open spaces of the ranch to the suffocating confines of Room 314 was a stark injustice that weighed heavily on the air. The room smelled of sharp bleach, starched linen, and the faint, unmistakable metallic odor of finality. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was a mechanical substitute for the crickets and the wind she was used to. Martha lay on the narrow bed, her breathing shallow and labored, her skin pale as parchment. Over her chest, her frail fingers clutched a faded, dog-eared photograph of a man in a straw hat, smiling with the kind of pure, unburdened joy that only existed in the past. She had been given days, perhaps only hours. Her children, scattered by the winds of economic necessity, were racing across the state in beat-up trucks, praying to the Almighty that the tires would hold and the engines would not fail before they could say goodbye. But Martha had made one final, impossible request to the clinic staff. She did not ask for a miracle cure, nor did she ask for her debts to be erased. She asked for a song. Miles down the dusty highway, an unassuming black SUV rolled steadily toward the clinic. Inside sat a man who needed no introduction, a man whose face was carved from the same Texas limestone as the hills around them. George Strait stared out the tinted window, watching the familiar landscape roll by. He wore a crisp, perfectly ironed Western shirt, his signature Stetson resting on his knee, his jaw set in a tight, unyielding line. The king of country had played for millions, his voice echoing in massive stadiums filled with roaring crowds, his walls lined with platinum records and gold trophies. Yet, as the vehicle turned into the gravel parking lot of the hospice, an unfamiliar weight settled squarely on his broad shoulders. He felt a profound sense of vulnerability, a quiet dread that no amount of fame could shield him from. He was stepping out of the realm of superstardom and into the sacred, terrifying space of human mortality. As George stepped out of the vehicle, the crunch of his boots on the gravel echoed like a gunshot in the quiet evening air. The heat of the asphalt radiated upward, but a cold chill ran down his spine. Pulling up right beside him was another vehicle, from which emerged a vision of warmth and light. Dolly Parton stepped onto the Texas dirt, her presence immediately softening the harsh edges of the afternoon. She was dressed elegantly, but her usual flamboyant sparkle was muted, replaced by a solemn, deeply respectful demeanor. Her eyes, framed by her iconic blonde hair, were already shimmering with unshed tears. She walked over to George, and without a single word, she reached out and placed her small, delicate hand on his forearm. It was a silent exchange of profound understanding between two giants of the industry, a mutual acknowledgement that their crowns and titles meant absolutely nothing in the face of what they were about to do. George nodded slowly, swallowing hard against the sudden tightness in his throat. He reached into the back of the SUV and pulled out his acoustic guitar case, gripping the leather handle so tightly his knuckles turned white. They walked through the sliding glass doors of the clinic, and the atmosphere instantly shifted. The bustling nurses and orderlies stopped in their tracks. The sight of these two towering figures of American culture walking down the linoleum hallway of a palliative care unit was jarring, a collision of two entirely different universes. But neither George nor Dolly offered the bright, camera-ready smiles the world was accustomed to. Their faces were masks of deep reverence. They were guided to a quiet corner just outside room 314, where the clinic director, a weary-looking man with heavy bags under his eyes, stood holding a metal clipboard. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an irritating, relentless hum. The director spoke in a hushed, urgent whisper, glancing nervously at the closed door of the room. He explained the grim reality of the situation. Martha had taken a severe turn for the worse during the early hours of the morning. Her lungs, scarred by decades of breathing in the dry dust of the fields and battling relentless bouts of pneumonia, were finally giving out. The oxygen tanks were doing all they could, but the body was shutting down. The director looked directly into George's eyes, his voice trembling slightly. He told them that there was no more time. The clock was no longer measured in days, but in ragged, desperate breaths. The urgency of the moment crashed over George like a physical blow. The man who was used to controlling arenas with a single strum of his guitar suddenly felt entirely powerless. The wealth, the influence, the global adoration, none of it could buy this hard-working widow a single extra hour of life. The sheer injustice of it all, that a woman who had given everything to the earth was now suffocating away from it, gnawed at his soul. George leaned his weight slightly against the cool plaster of the hallway wall, his head bowing down so the brim of his hat hid his eyes. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to anchor himself in the values his father had taught him, the simple Christian duty of serving those in need. Dolly stepped closer, her perfume a comforting blend of flowers and grace, masking the clinical smell of the corridor. She whispered softly to him, her voice a soothing balm, reminding him that they were not there to save her body, but to guide her spirit home. They were there to be the vessel for a memory, to deliver a piece of peace to a soul that had known nothing but struggle. With a final resolute nod, George stood tall. He shifted the guitar case to his left hand, and with his right, he reached for the cold metal handle of the door to room 314. The hinges opened with a soft, agonizing creak. The golden light of the setting sun was filtering through the plastic blinds, casting stripes of light and shadow across the small, sparse room. The rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the oxygen machine dominated the silence. As they stepped across the threshold, the world outside ceased to exist. There were no more sold-out tours, no more flashing cameras, no more music charts. There was only the bed, the fading light, and the frail figure of a true Texas cowgirl waiting for the final sunset. Martha lay there, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling in a terrifyingly shallow rhythm. The photograph of her husband rested securely over her heart. George and Dolly stood frozen at the foot of the bed, the sheer gravity of the moment pinning them to the floor. The King of Country and the Queen of Nashville were reduced to humble witnesses in the presence of everyday majesty, bracing themselves for the most important performance of their entire lives. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them, sealing off the sterile, humming corridor of the clinic and locking the three of them inside a space that felt suspended outside of time. The fading Texas sun pushed its way through the plastic slats of the window blinds, painting long golden stripes across the pale green walls and the linoleum floor. Dust motes danced lazily in the shafts of light, looking like tiny floating embers. The only sound was the mechanical, rhythmic hiss and click of the oxygen concentrator, a cruel reminder of the fragile thread keeping the woman in the bed tethered to this earth. George Strait stood perfectly still at the foot of the narrow hospital bed. His tall, broad-shouldered frame, usually a symbol of unshakable cowboy stoicism, felt impossibly heavy. He held his acoustic guitar case by his side, his large, calloused thumb rhythmically tracing the stitching on the leather handle. Beside him, Dolly Parton seemed to absorb the melancholic light of the room. Her usual vibrant, larger-than-life aura was deliberately subdued, replaced by a profound, radiant empathy that seemed to warm the cold clinical air. She stood with her hands clasped delicately in front of her eyes fixed on the fragile figure resting beneath the thin white cotton blankets. Martha lay perfectly still, her chest rising and falling with a shallow, agonizing effort. Her silver hair, usually tied back in a strict, practical bun for working the fields, was now loose, spreading across the stark white pillow like a halo of spun glass. Her face was a map of the Texas hill country, deeply lined by decades of squinting into the brutal summer sun, her skin tanned and weathered like an old saddle. Beneath her frail, trembling hands rested the faded photograph of the man who had been her entire world, the man whose absence had forced her to carry the weight of the ranch on her own shoulders. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence was thick, heavy with the unspoken weight of mortality. Then, very slowly, Martha's eyelids fluttered, the eyelashes, pale and sparse, parted to reveal eyes that were a faded, milky blue, like the sky after a long, devastating drought. She blinked against the golden light, her gaze drifting aimlessly for a second before focusing on the two towering figures standing at the foot of her bed. There was no sudden gasp. There were no tears of hysterical disbelief, no frantic reaching out like a starstruck fan. Martha simply looked at them with the quiet, unshakable dignity of a woman who had spent her entire life facing down tornadoes, droughts, and the crushing weight of grief. She looked at George, taking in his starched shirt and the solemn set of his jaw, and then she looked at Dolly, seeing the genuine, shimmering sorrow in the woman's eyes. A faint, trembling smile touched the corners of Martha's dry, cracked lips. George swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He slowly reached up and removed his black Stetson, holding it respectfully over his chest. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated reverence, the way a man stands before an altar. Martha's voice, when it finally came, was nothing more than a dry, rustling whisper, like dead leaves blowing across a wooden porch. She did not ask them how their tour was going, nor did she mention their fame. She spoke to them as if they were old neighbors who had just dropped by to sit on the veranda. She told them about the dirt. She spoke of how the Texas soil got under your fingernails and never truly washed out, no matter how hard you scrubbed with lye soap. She talked about the unforgiving heat that would bake the ground until it cracked open like a broken heart, and the sheer back-breaking agony of hauling hay bales when your muscles screamed for mercy. Her voice trembled as she recalled the day the sheriff drove up the long dirt driveway to tell her about the tractor accident, the day the light went out of her world and left her alone with 3 hungry mouths to feed and a mortgage that threatened to swallow them whole. Through it all, George and Dolly listened, completely paralyzed by the raw, unvarnished truth of her life. Dolly took a slow step forward, her eyes welling with tears that threatened to spill over her carefully applied makeup. George simply nodded, his jaw tight, whispering a soft, gravelly affirmation, acknowledging the profound suffering of the woman before him. Martha's breathing grew slightly more ragged as she continued. She told them that in the darkest, most terrifying nights of her life, when the bank was threatening foreclosure and the winter wind howled through the cracks in the farmhouse walls, she would sit on the porch in her late husband's rocking chair. She would turn on a battered silver AM radio, the dial glowing faintly in the dark. And it was there, in the lonely expanse of the plains, that the voices of George Strait and Dolly Parton became her lifeline. She told George that his steady, unwavering baritone made her feel like the ground beneath her feet was still solid, that his songs about hard work and quiet faith gave her the strength to put her boots on the next morning. She looked at Dolly and whispered that her high, sweet voice sounded like the angels her husband used to preach about. a reminder that there was a heaven waiting above the dust and the pain. The weight of her words crashed over George like a physical blow. For decades, he had stood on stages bathed in blinding spotlights, singing lyrics written on pieces of paper, receiving awards made of hollow metal. But standing in this sterile room, listening to a dying widow explain how his voice was the only thing that kept her from surrendering to despair, he felt an overwhelming sense of humility. His fame meant nothing. His wealth meant nothing. He was merely an instrument, a vessel used by a higher power to deliver comfort to a woman who had carried a cross far heavier than he could ever imagine. Martha's trembling hand slowly moved over the photograph on her chest. She took a shallow, rattling breath, trying to gather the strength to explain the final piece of her puzzle, the reason she had asked them to come. She wanted to tell them about the old gospel hymn her husband used to hum while he fixed the fences, the melody that was woven into the very fabric of their marriage. She wanted to explain why that specific song was the only thing she needed to hear before she closed her eyes for the last time, but the words never came. Suddenly, Martha's chest hitched violently. Her eyes widened in a sudden, terrifying panic as her lungs completely betrayed her. A wet, agonizing cough tore through her frail body, shaking her violently against the mattress. She gasped for air, but the damaged tissue simply could not take in the oxygen. Her hands clawed weakly at the bedsheets, the photograph of her husband slipping from her grasp and fluttering to the floor. The transition from quiet reflection to absolute terror was instantaneous. The monitors beside the bed, which had been emitting a steady, rhythmic hum, suddenly shrieked. A high-pitched, relentless alarm pierced the sacred silence of the room, a mechanical scream signaling that the heart was failing. The oxygen was dropping. The end was arriving prematurely. George dropped his hat. It hit the linoleum floor with a soft thud, completely forgotten. He lunged forward instinctively, his large hands reaching out as if he could physically hold her spirit inside her failing body, but he froze, terrified of breaking her fragile bones. Dolly gasped, pressing both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer horror as she watched the woman fight for a single breath of air. The heavy wooden door flew open, crashing against the wall. A team of nurses and a doctor rushed into the room, a blur of blue scrubs and panicked urgency. They shoved past the two music legends without a second glance. In this room, at this exact moment, George Strait and Dolly Parton were not royalty. They were just two helpless bystanders in the way of a medical emergency. An orderly grabbed George by the shoulder and roughly pulled him back. George stumbled, his boots scraping harshly against the floor, until his broad back hit the cold plaster of the far wall. Dolly was pushed right beside him, and she immediately reached out, grabbing George's arm with a grip that was shockingly strong. Her nails dug into the fabric of his starched shirt. George instinctively wrapped his large arm around her shoulders, pulling her close as they watched the chaotic, terrifying scene unfold. The doctor shouted orders, adjusting the oxygen flow, checking the monitors, while a nurse frantically prepared a syringe. The sounds of the medical machinery, the frantic voices, and Martha's agonizing struggle for air created a suffocating symphony of panic. George stood pinned against the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stared at the chaotic blur of the medical staff, a profound, sickening wave of helplessness washing over him. He had spent his life solving problems. He could fix a broken engine, he could soothe a restless horse, he could command a stadium of 80,000 people to sing in perfect harmony. But right now, watching a woman suffocate under fluorescent lights, he was entirely powerless. All the platinum records in his mansion, all the millions of dollars in his bank accounts, could not buy Martha a single painless breath. He closed his eyes tight, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth ached, and he sent a desperate, silent prayer up to the heavens, begging for mercy, begging for just a little more time. Before we continue with this heartbreaking journey, let us take a brief moment to reflect. Life is incredibly fragile, a fleeting whisper in the wind. We often get caught up in the noise of the world, forgetting that the most profound moments happen in quiet rooms, holding the hands of those who have fought the hardest battles. Stories of genuine empathy, of stripping away titles and egos to simply be human for one another, are the stories that truly matter. If you believe in the power of these untold stories, if you believe in honoring the memory of hard-working everyday heroes like Martha, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps ensure that these deeply human narratives continue to be shared and remembered. Now, let us return to room 314. The frantic energy in the room slowly began to dissipate. The harsh screaming alarm of the heart monitor was silenced by a nurse, replaced once again by the steady, albeit slightly faster, rhythmic beep. The doctor stepped back, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion. He murmured something quietly to the head nurse, who nodded and began to adjust the blankets around Martha's trembling form. The crisis had passed, but it had taken a devastating toll. The room felt heavier now, the air thick with the undeniable reality that the final curtain was drawing incredibly close. The medical staff quietly filed out of the room, their rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum, leaving George and Dolly alone once more with the dying widow. The silence that followed was not just quiet, it was sacred. It was the heavy, breathless pause that occurs right after a violent storm, when the world is bruised but still standing. The golden hour light had deepened into a rich, melancholic amber, casting long, mournful shadows across the room. George slowly peeled himself away from the wall. His breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling beneath his starched shirt. He looked down and saw his Stetson lying upside down on the floor next to the faded photograph of Martha's husband. He bent down, his knees popping slightly in the quiet room, and picked up both items. He carefully dusted off the photograph with his thumb, looking at the smiling face of the man who had meant everything to the woman in the bed. He walked slowly back to the foot of the bed. Martha's eyes were closed, her face pale and exhausted, but her chest was moving with a fragile, steady rhythm. She had survived the attack. She was still here. Dolly did not hesitate. The invisible wall that society builds between a global superstar and a humble fan was completely, utterly annihilated. She walked past the foot of the bed, moving with a quiet, determined grace. She ignored the sterile protocols, ignored the dirt and the despair, and sat right down on the edge of the thin mattress. The springs creaked softly under her weight. She reached out and took Martha's right hand. The contrast was stark. Dolly's hands were soft, manicured, adorned with subtle jewelry. Martha's hand was cold, the skin rough like sandpaper, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, the fingernails chipped and yellowed. Dolly enveloped that battered hand in both of hers, bringing it close to her chest, transferring her own warmth, her own life force into the dying woman. Martha slowly opened her eyes. The exhaustion in them was absolute, but the panic was gone. She looked at Dolly, feeling the warmth of the singer's hands, and a single crystal-clear tear slipped from the corner of her eye, tracing a path down the deep wrinkles of her cheek. She then slowly turned her head, her gaze finding George. She gave him a very faint, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent plea. It was time. George felt a lump form in his throat, thick and suffocating. He swallowed hard, nodding back at her. He moved toward the corner of the room, his boots making soft, deliberate sounds on the floor. He grabbed a simple, uncomfortable metal folding chair that was leaning against the wall. He dragged it over, the metal legs scraping briefly against the linoleum, and positioned it right next to the bed, opposite Dolly. He sat down heavily. He reached for his leather guitar case, resting it on his lap. The sound of the metal latches snapping open echoed sharply in the quiet room. He opened the lid, revealing the polished wood of his acoustic guitar. He lifted the instrument out with the care and reverence of a man holding a newborn child. He rested the curved body of the guitar on his right knee, his large left hand wrapping around the neck. He looked at Martha. He looked at the photograph he had placed gently on her bedside table. He looked at Dolly, who was still holding Martha's hand, her eyes locked on his, shining with an unspoken, immense strength. The stage was set. There were no blinding spotlights, no roaring crowds, no soundboards or amplifiers. There was only the hum of the oxygen machine, the fading light of the Texas sun, and 3 human souls preparing to face the great unknown together. The spectacle of celebrity had vanished entirely, leaving behind nothing but the raw, beautiful, and heartbreaking reality of human communion. George Strait adjusted the heavy wooden body of the acoustic guitar against his chest, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of the instrument that had been his constant companion across decades of sold-out arenas and endless highway miles. But here, in the suffocating quiet of room 314, the guitar felt different. It felt like a sacred vessel. He rested his large, calloused fingers over the steel strings, the pads of his fingertips pressing into the metal with a practiced, gentle precision. He did not look at the door, where the shadows of the clinic director and several nurses had gathered, drawn by the invisible pull of the profound communion happening within. He looked only at Martha. The fading Texas sun had finally dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky bruised with deep shades of violet and indigo. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hallway spilled through the small glass pane in the door, but inside the room, the shadows grew long and soft. Dolly Parton sat perfectly still on the edge of the mattress, her thumb gently stroking the back of Martha's weathered, bruised hand. Dolly's eyes were locked onto George's, offering a silent, unwavering pillar of strength. George took a slow, deep breath, the scent of rubbing alcohol and starched linen filling his lungs, and he brought his right hand down across the strings. The first chord rang out, pure and resonant. The sound of the vibrating wood was warm, organic, and startlingly loud in the sterile, mechanical environment of the hospice room. It was a simple G chord, the foundational bedrock of 1,000 country songs, but tonight, it sounded like a prayer echoing in an empty cathedral. He picked the strings slowly, establishing the gentle, rolling rhythm of the old gospel hymn Martha's husband used to hum on the porch. There was no backing band, no steel guitar weeping in the background, no perfectly tuned monitors. There was only the raw, unpolished truth of the wood and the wire. Dolly closed her eyes, tilting her head slightly upward, as if feeling the warmth of a sun that only she could see. She opened her mouth and the first note slipped past her lips. Her voice was entirely stripped of the studio magic, the shimmering reverb, and the polished perfection that the world knew. It was raw, fragile, and breathtakingly beautiful. It was the voice of the Appalachian Mountains, the voice of generations of women who had sung their children to sleep in drafty cabins, the voice of pure, unadulterated soul. She sang the opening line of the hymn, her vibrato trembling slightly, carrying the heavy, agonizing weight of Martha's long, hard life. The melody wrapped around the cold room like a warm, heavy quilt, instantly softening the sharp edges of the medical equipment and the terrifying reality of death. George brought his voice in on the second line. His legendary baritone was a deep, steady rumble, anchoring Dolly's angelic high notes to the dusty Texas earth. They harmonized perfectly, not because they had rehearsed, but because they understood the profound universal language of suffering and grace. They sang about a place beyond the river, a place where the heavy burdens of the world are finally laid down, where the crops never fail, where the banks do not knock on the door, and where broken hearts are mended by the hands of the divine. Martha lay motionless, her shallow breathing falling into rhythm with the gentle strumming of George's guitar. Her milky blue eyes were closed, but the deep, painful lines etched into her forehead began to smooth out. The restless, terrifying anxiety that had gripped her frail body only moments before was entirely washed away. For the first time in what felt like decades, she did not look like a widow carrying the weight of a ruined ranch. She looked like a young woman resting on a porch swing, listening to the man she loved. As the song moved into the second verse, the emotional gravity of the room began to shift, growing unbearably heavy. George looked down at the fretboard, his fingers moving automatically, and then his gaze drifted to the bedside table. He saw the faded photograph of Martha's husband, the smiling man in the straw hat who had been taken too soon, leaving this fierce, loyal woman to fight the unforgiving world entirely alone. He looked at Martha's hands, held so tenderly by Dolly, and saw the decades of brutal, unrewarded labor carved into her knuckles. A sudden, overwhelming wave of grief and profound humility crashed into George's chest. The sheer injustice of her suffering, contrasted with the breathtaking purity of her faith, shattered the stoic armor he had worn his entire life. He realized that every song he had ever sung about the working class, about the dirt and the struggle of the American heartland, was standing right here in this room, gasping for her final breaths. In the middle of a chord transition, George Strait, the unshakable king of country, choked. His throat seized tight. The lyrics caught in his chest, blocked by a massive, suffocating lump of pure emotion. His voice cracked, a harsh, broken sound that echoed painfully in the quiet room. And then he stopped singing altogether. He ducked his head, the brim of his hat hiding his eyes, as a hot, unbidden tear slipped down his cheek and splashed onto the polished wood of his guitar. His fingers trembled violently on the strings, the rhythm faltering. He was completely overcome, drowning in the raw, devastating beauty of the moment. He was no longer a superstar. He was just a man, weeping for the pain of a stranger. Dolly did not flinch. When George's voice broke and fell away, she simply squeezed Martha's hand tighter and leaned forward. She carried the melody entirely on her own, her voice rising in volume and intensity, a fiercely maternal force shielding George's vulnerability. She sang the next line with a soaring, tear-stained power, holding the sacred space together while her friend fell apart. She looked at George, her own eyes shining with heavy tears, and gave him a slow, encouraging nod. George swallowed hard, his jaw trembling. He took a ragged, shaky breath, wiping his cheek roughly against the shoulder of his starched shirt. He forced his fingers to steady, finding the rhythm of the strings once more. Slowly, bravely, he brought his baritone back into the harmony, his voice now thick, raspy, and drenched in a profound sorrow. They moved into the final chorus together, their voices blending into a mournful, triumphant whisper. The final chord rang out from the acoustic guitar, vibrating in the air for a long, breathless moment, before slowly fading into the relentless mechanical hiss of the oxygen machine. Silence descended upon room 314, heavy and absolute. Martha's eyes remained closed. A single crystalline tear escaped the corner of her eye, tracking slowly down the deep creases of her weathered cheek, catching the faint light from the hallway. A smile, incredibly faint, but radiating an absolute, transcendent peace, touched her dry lips. She took one very slow, shallow breath. Her voice was barely a sigh, a fragile wisp of air brushing against the silence. I can hear him now. Her chest settled. It did not rise again. The tension completely vanished from her frail shoulders, leaving behind nothing but an empty, peaceful shell. The monitor beside the bed, which had been tracking the frantic, struggling rhythm of her failing heart, let out a single, continuous, flat tone. In the doorway, the clinic director buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The nurses leaned against the doorframe, tears streaming freely down their faces, deeply moved by the quiet, devastating majesty of what they had just witnessed. George sat frozen in the metal chair, his hands still gripping the neck of the guitar, his head bowed low. Dolly gently released Martha's lifeless hand, laying it softly across the woman's chest, right next to the photograph of her husband. Dolly leaned down, pressing a tender, lingering kiss to Martha's forehead, whispering a final, silent blessing into her silver hair. The transition from the sacred space of the room to the cold reality of the hallway was jarring. George carefully placed his guitar back into its leather case, snapping the latches shut with a sound that felt entirely too loud. He picked up his Stetson from the chair, holding it tightly in his hands. Dolly walked beside him, her arm linked through his, as they stepped out of room 314 and gently pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind them, leaving Martha to the quiet peace she had so fiercely earned. The moment the door clicked shut, the invisible dam holding back George's emotions completely shattered. He took 2 steps down the sterile, brightly lit corridor before his knees buckled slightly. He turned away from the nurses, stepping into a quiet alcove, and pressed his broad back against the cold, unyielding plaster of the wall. The king of country dropped his head, the Stetson falling from his grasp once more, and he wept. It was not a quiet, composed sorrow. It was the deep, shuddering, chest-heaving grief of a man who had just touched the very bottom of human vulnerability. He cried for Martha, for the brutal unfairness of her life, and for the profound, humbling honor of being the one to guide her out of the dark. Dolly did not say a word. She stepped into the alcove, wrapped her arms around his waist, and pressed her face against his chest. She held him fiercely, letting her own tears soak into the fabric of his shirt. There, in the lonely, fluorescent-lit hallway of a Texas hospice clinic, 2 of the most famous musicians on the planet, stood holding each other, entirely stripped of their legends, reduced to two broken-hearted human beings mourning the loss of a woman the world would never know. Time moves forward, relentless and unyielding, washing away the quiet moments and replacing them with the loud, chaotic roar of life. Weeks later, the warm, humid air of a Texas summer night hung heavy over a massive open-air stadium. 80,000 people packed the stands, a sea of cowboy hats, boots, and glowing cell phone screens. The smell of spilled beer, roasted peanuts, and sweet tobacco smoke filled the atmosphere. The crowd roared with a deafening, thunderous energy, chanting for the man they had all paid to see. The stadium lights suddenly plunged into absolute darkness. The roar of the crowd shifted into a frantic, anticipating scream. A single blinding white spotlight pierced the darkness, cutting through the humid air and illuminating the center of the massive stage. There stood George Strait. He looked exactly as he always did. The immaculate Western shirt, the perfectly creased jeans, the iconic black Stetson pulled low over his eyes. He strapped his acoustic guitar across his chest, stepping up to the microphone stand. The crowd's cheering reached a fever pitch, shaking the very concrete of the stadium. But George did not signal the band to start the upbeat, fiery opening number written on the set list at his feet. He held up a single, large hand, signaling for quiet. Slowly, the roar of 80,000 people began to fade, replaced by a confused, respectful murmur, and then a breathless silence. The sheer command he held over the massive arena was staggering. George leaned into the microphone, his hands gripping the wood of his guitar. When he spoke, his voice was not the booming, confident voice of an entertainer. It was quiet, gravelly, and thick with an emotion that immediately sent a shiver through the massive crowd. He looked out over the sea of faces, but his eyes were seeing a small, sterile room bathed in amber light. He spoke into the microphone, his voice echoing across the vast expanse of the stadium. He told the crowd that he was going to change the set list tonight. He told them that he had recently met a woman, a true, hard-working Texas cowgirl who had spent her entire life pulling life out of the dry dirt, asking for nothing and giving everything. He told them that she had gone home to be with her husband. He did not mention the hospital, and he did not mention his own tears. He simply stated that the next song was not for the charts, not for the radio, and not for the applause. It was dedicated to a woman named Martha, a woman who represented the very soul of every lyric he had ever sung. George closed his eyes, took a deep breath of the Texas night air, and struck the first chord on his guitar. He sang with a depth and a raw, bleeding passion that the audience had never heard before. Every note carried the weight of the calluses on Martha's hands. Every lyric was a testament to her quiet endurance. He was not performing for the 80,000 people in the stands. He was singing directly up to the stars, making sure the melody reached a porch swing somewhere far beyond the clouds. Miles away in a brightly lit television studio in Nashville, Dolly Parton sat in a velvet chair opposite a famous interviewer. The cameras were rolling, capturing her glittering rhinestone dress and her flawless makeup. The interviewer, smiling a polished, rehearsed smile, asked Dolly about the greatest venues she had ever played in her legendary career. He listed off the grandest stages in the world, the massive arenas in London, the historic theaters in New York, expecting a glamorous anecdote about royalty or record-breaking crowds. Dolly's bright, camera-ready smile slowly faded, softening into an expression of profound, quiet reverence. She looked past the interviewer, past the bright studio lights and the bustling camera crew. Her eyes shimmered with a familiar unshed moisture. She folded her hands gracefully in her lap, her voice dropping to a soft, intimate whisper that completely commanded the attention of everyone in the room. She told the interviewer that she had seen the brightest lights the world had to offer, and she had heard the loudest applause a human being could ever receive. But she stated with absolute, unshakable certainty that the most sacred, important stage she had ever stepped foot on was not made of wood or steel. It was the linoleum floor of room 314. She explained that true greatness in this life is not measured by the gold on your walls or the numbers in your bank account. It is measured by your willingness to strip away your pride, to sit in the quiet dark with someone who is suffering, and to hold their hand when they are too weak to hold on themselves. The stories of the working men and women, the ones who bleed into the earth and ask for no recognition, are the only stories that truly matter. The legacy we leave behind is not found in the echoes of a roaring stadium, but in the quiet dignity we offer to the broken-hearted, proving that even the tallest giants must eventually bow their heads, take off their hats, and recognize the divine grace in a simple, calloused hand.